The innkeeper stands at the gate of his own house. 3 men are inside. They have been his guests for 9 days. They arrived hungry, cold, carrying a story about a road accident that had left them with nothing. He fed them, gave them beds, extended, because his wife had taught him that kindness was the highest virtue a man could carry, his full hospitality without asking them for anything in return. Tonight, they finished the last of the rice. Tonight, one of them has taken the small iron box from the shelf by the fire. The box with the winter savings, the coins his father and grandfather had added to, one at a time, across 60 years. Tonight, they are preparing to leave, and the innkeeper stands at the gate of his own house, unable to stop them, not because they are armed, because he does not know how to be unkind. Here is the truth most men learn too late about kindness. Kindness without strength is not kindness. It is a soft cage the kind man builds around himself, and eventually, a soft cage he ends up offering to the people he loves. The world does not reward gentleness the way a good-hearted man believes it should. The world has always contained men who read gentleness as opportunity, and the kind man who refuses to develop any other capacity, any hardness, any discernment, any willingness to draw a line, eventually meets these men. And when he meets them, his kindness does not protect him, it exposes him. The kind man at the gate. His name is Shiro. He is 42 years old, an innkeeper in a small mountain village 3 days north of the nearest town. He inherited the inn from his father, who inherited it from his father. 3 generations of patient, modest work. 3 generations of feeding travelers, offering beds, carrying on the small, quiet trade of a family that had never harmed anyone. And Shiro, the gentlest of the 3, had carried the kindness further than either of his ancestors. He gave credit to men who could not pay. He fed beggars at the back door. He refused, even when his wife had been alive, to turn away anyone who knocked. His wife had died 6 years before, of a fever that took her in 3 days. Before she died, she had said to him, with the specific clarity of someone who knows she has little time, "Continue being kind. It is the best part of you." He had continued past the point where continuing made sense, continued into a life so porous, so undefended, that men in the town had begun, quietly, without cruelty, on simply as an observation, to say of him, "Shiro is a good man, but he is a man without walls." The 3 travelers had arrived on the 9th day of the month. Shiro had seen immediately that they were different from ordinary travelers. Something in the way they assessed the inn as they entered. Something in the specific quality of their attention, not on him, but on the small, valuable objects in the room. The iron kettle, the old sword above the fireplace, the small brass oil lamp that had been in his family for 4 generations. He had noticed these things, and he had done what he always did when his noticing produced an uncomfortable signal. He had dismissed it. He had told himself that uncharitable thoughts about guests were unworthy, that his wife would have been disappointed in him, that the small discomfort was his own suspicion, not a genuine warning from the part of him that had been quietly watching for 8,000 days of innkeeping. He had offered them food, beds, the full hospitality his wife had asked him to continue. And now, 9 days later, he stood at the gate. One of the men came out carrying the iron box, tucked under his arm as casually as a bundle of firewood. He saw Shiro at the gate. He stopped for a moment, looked at him, and this was the part that would hurt Shiro for the rest of his life, in a way the loss of the money would not. The man smiled, not cruelly, not with the triumph of a thief, with the specific quality of a man who has, for 9 days, been assessing what kind of man Shiro was, and who was, in this moment, having his assessment confirmed. The man was smiling because he had been right. Shiro was not going to stop him. Shiro's kindness had been for 9 days the bars of a cage that Shiro himself had built around himself. And the man with the iron box was walking out of that cage with everything Shiro's family had saved for 6 decades, because Shiro had, through a lifetime of refusing to become anything other than kind, made himself a man who could not defend anything. Not his father's money, not his grandfather's memory, not the small iron box that represented every coin 3 generations of his family had carefully placed inside it. The man walked past him. The other 2 followed. They did not say a word. They did not need to. They had read the man at the gate correctly for 9 days, and there was no further reading required. They disappeared into the darkness of the road beyond the village. And Shiro stood at the gate of his own house for a very long time. He did not weep. That would come later. What he did, for the first hour after they had gone, was stand perfectly still, with the specific stillness of a man whose entire understanding of himself has just been, without warning, exposed as inadequate. He had thought, for 42 years, that he was a kind man. He saw now that kindness had been only half of what he was. The other half, the half no one had ever taught him to develop, had been cowardice wearing the costume of kindness. Because the kind thing, in the specific situation of the 9 days, would have been to stop the men on the 3rd day, when the signs had become clear. The kind thing would have been to defend his family's history from men who would never have earned it. He had not done the kind thing. He had done the soft thing. And the soft thing and the kind thing, he understood now with a clarity he had spent his whole life avoiding, were not the same thing. They were almost opposite things. Somewhere inside him, his wife's voice was still speaking. Continue being kind. It is the best part of you. She had not meant continue being soft. She had meant something he had never understood, because he had never needed to understand it while she was alive. She had meant, continue caring for people, continue giving when giving was right, continue refusing to become cruel. But she had assumed, as kind women often assume about the men they love, that he already had the other half, that he already knew how to stand at a gate and refuse to open it, that he already had the capacity to say, when a man arrived whose arrival required refusing, "You cannot come in." She had assumed this because she had always stood at the gate with him. She had been the hardness to his softness. She had turned away the men he had been too kind to turn away. She had, for 16 years, been the invisible half of his kindness, the half that made the kindness actually safe, actually useful, actually something that protected the house, rather than emptied it. And when she died, 6 years ago, the invisible half of his kindness had died with her. He had continued only the visible half, and tonight, the visible half alone had cost him everything his father and grandfather had ever saved. He sat down, finally, on the ground beside the gate, because his legs would not continue holding him, and he looked at the empty road where the 3 men had disappeared. And for the first time in 42 years, Shiro understood that he had not, in any true sense, yet become a man. He had become a fragment of one. The soft fragment. The swordsmith in the next province. Shiro did not sleep that night. He sat by the cold fire until dawn. When the sun came up, he washed his face, put on his walking clothes, locked the inn, and walked out of the village for the first time in 11 years. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that he could not remain in the house where the 3 men had taught him what he was. He walked north for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he arrived at a small mountain settlement where a swordsmith lived. He had not known the swordsmith was there. His legs had simply given out. The swordsmith was an old man named Kyuzo. Shiro had heard of him once, years before, from a traveler who had described Kyuzo as a man who did not sell swords, who gave them only to men he had decided were ready to carry one. Shiro had forgotten this detail for a decade. He remembered it now, sitting outside Kyuzo's workshop, too tired to move further. Kyuzo came out after a while. He looked at Shiro for a long moment. "You did not come here for a sword." "No." "Then why are you here?" Shiro tried to answer, could not. Eventually he said, 3 men took everything my family had saved. I stood at the gate and let them. I do not know how to be a man who does not let them." Kyuzo nodded slowly. "Come inside." The workshop was warm. A fire burned low and steady in the forge. A partially finished blade lay across the anvil. Kyuzo gestured for Shiro to sit, poured tea, handed him a cup. "Eat first, talk later." After Shiro had eaten, Kyuzo returned to his work at the forge. "Now tell me, everything, not a summary. The 9 days, your wife, your father, the 100 smaller kindnesses you gave to men who did not deserve them. How did you know there were 100 smaller failures? Because there always are. A man does not arrive at the gate the way you arrived without 100 smaller failures behind him." Shiro talked, for hours, about his wife, about the way he had continued her instruction without understanding what she had actually meant, about the men he had given credit to who had never paid, about the small, quiet accumulation of being taken advantage of, which he had called kindness, which had not been kindness, which had been fear wearing kindness as a coat. Kyuzo listened without interrupting. worked at the forge in the steady rhythm of a master who could work and listen at the same time. When Shiro finally finished, Kyuzo set down his hammer. "Musashi wrote something," he said, "that most men miss, because it sounds cold. It is not cold. It is the truest thing he ever wrote about what it means to care for other people. He wrote, 'Have respect for the gods and Buddhas, but do not depend on them.' What does that have to do with kindness? Everything." Kyuzo paused. "It means honor what you value, serve what you love, but do not, through the honoring and the serving, make yourself helpless. Your wife taught you to be kind. This was the right thing for her to teach you. But you took her teaching and made it the whole of you, or you depended on it the way a man depends on a god, to the point where you could not act outside its boundaries, even when acting outside its boundaries was exactly what the kindness itself required." He looked at Shiro directly. "The men you let into your house, if you had turned them away on the third day, would that have been unkind?" Shiro thought. "No, the unkindness was to my father's memory, to my grandfather's 60 years of saving, to the guests who would have come after them and found nothing in my inn to receive. Yes, but I didn't see it that way at the time. You didn't see it because you could not see past the specific form your wife's teaching had taken inside you. And forms are the most dangerous things a man can depend on. Honor the teaching, serve the truth underneath the teaching, but never let the form of the teaching become more important to you than the truth it was trying to point at. Your wife taught you to be kind. The truth underneath her teaching was care for people. Act from love rather than from fear. Kindness was her way of saying it. Kindness was the shape her love took in her mouth, in her hands, in the specific person she was. But kindness as a form is not enough. Not for a man who has to stand at a gate alone and decide whether to open it or close it." Shiro sat with this. He had taken his wife's love for him, and her love for people, and her specific way of expressing that love, and he had reduced all of it to a rule: be kind. And the rule had become a prison. His wife had been kind because her kindness was part of her strength. She could turn men away when turning them away was right. He had not inherited her strength when she died. He had only inherited her gentleness, and gentleness without strength is not kindness. It is the slow bleed of a man being consumed by the small daily teeth of a world that does not care about his intentions. How do I become the other half? Kyuzo walked back to the forge, picked up his hammer, over his shoulder. You stay here. You work with me for as long as it takes, not to become a swordsmith, to become the kind of man who can hold a sword, even a sword he will never actually use, without flinching. How long? However long it takes. You will know you are ready when you are no longer afraid of the sword. And when you are no longer afraid of the sword, you will understand that the sword was never what you were afraid of. Shiro looked at the partially finished blade on the anvil. Something in him tightened. He understood in that moment that the work ahead of him was going to require him to become a man he had, for 42 years, been unconsciously avoiding becoming. A man capable of hardness, not cruelty, not aggression, not the casual violence of men like the three who had taken his family's money. A different hardness, the quiet hardness that allows a kind man to protect what he loves. The hardness without which kindness eventually kills both the kind man and what the kind man was trying to protect. Kyuzo began to work the metal. The sound of the hammer filled the small room. Shiro sat on the bench, watching the sparks rise from the anvil. He was going to have to stay here for a long time, not because Kyuzo required it, because he required it. He had arrived as a man who did not yet know how to protect what mattered to him, and he would not leave. He understood this with a clarity he did not yet fully welcome, until he had become, under Kyuzo's patient instruction, the other half of the man his wife had hoped he would be. The wrong hardness. Shiro stayed through the winter. He did not touch a sword. He swept the workshop, kept the fire, carried coal, prepared meals, slept on a thin mat in the corner of the forge. Kyuzo did not teach him anything directly. Shiro watched the way the old man held a hammer, the way he decided when metal was ready, the way he refused to rush, the way he refused, also, to linger when the moment required decisiveness. The whole practice of the forge was a contradiction that was not a contradiction. Patience and decisiveness, softness and hardness. The lesson was not that he needed to become harder. The lesson was that he needed to become capable of both. Kyuzo was, by any measure, one of the kindest men Shiro had ever met. he was also one of the hardest. The hardness and the kindness were not separate. They were the same quality, expressed differently depending on what the moment required. And watching Kyuzo across a winter, Shiro began to understand what his wife had actually been. She had not been a kind woman, she had been a whole woman. The kindness he had seen in her was the visible part, the hardness. The hardness that had been keeping the inn safe while he performed the gentle part of the work had been invisible to him. He had inherited the visible half and called it her teaching. He had missed the invisible half entirely. By the spring, he thought he had understood. He told Kyuzo he was ready to return. "What have you learned?" "That I need hardness, that my wife had both and I only inherited one, that I must now develop the other." "And what will you do when you return?" "I will learn to turn men away when turning them away is right. I will defend what I have been given rather than letting it be drained." Kyuzo nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, "You will not go back yet." "Why?" "Because what you have just described is the trap." Shiro sat down. "What trap?" "You have identified the gap. Hardness. You are now planning to fill the gap by acquiring the specific thing that was missing." "Yes, this is what men reliably do. When they have had the specific awakening you have just had, they swing to the opposite pole. They go from being too soft to being too hard. And they do not realize they have swung to the opposite pole until years later, when the hardness they developed to protect what they loved has become the thing that alienates them from what they loved. The man who could not turn anyone away becomes the man who turns everyone away. The man who gave too much becomes the man who gives nothing. He calls this strength. He calls this discernment. He calls this the hard lesson he had to learn. It is not strength. It is the mirror image of his old weakness worn on the other side of his face. Shiro saw it. He had been preparing across the months of watching Kyuzo, not for integration, for replacement, for becoming the opposite of what he had been. And he could already see, in his own plans, the shape of the man he would become. He would turn men away reflexively. He would suspect every guest. He would let the inn become the house of a bitter man. He would not, in this version, be robbed again. He would also not, in this version, be a man worth knowing. How do I avoid it? You do not replace the softness with hardness. You place hardness next to the softness, and you let them live in you simultaneously. The kindness you had as a younger man was not wrong. It was only incomplete. You do not kill it. You add to it. You add the specific capacity your wife had, the capacity to stand at the gate and say no when no was what the situation required, the capacity to defend what needed defending without apology and without drama. And you keep both capacities inside you, available, not in tension. The kindness is not the opposite of the hardness. The hardness is not the opposite of the kindness. They are two expressions of the same deeper thing, which is care. Care for the good guest who needs a bed produces kindness. Care for the future guest who will need your inn to still exist when he arrives produces hardness toward the thief who would drain it. Same source, different expression. The man who cannot do both is not a man who cares. He is a man who is performing one half of care and calling it the whole. Shiro sat with this for a long time. He understood why he had been reluctant for weeks to leave. Some part of him had known he was not yet ready. He had learned to be hard. He had not yet learned to be hard and soft. The two halves were, inside him, still separate. Two different rooms in the same house. And the man walking into a situation still had to consciously decide which room to operate from. That was not integration. That was alternation. How do I integrate them? Time and practice and several more failures. Failures? Yes. You will leave here at some point. You will return to the inn, and you will reliably fail several more times in the opposite direction. You will turn away a guest who should not have been turned away. You will be hard toward a man who deserved softness. This is normal. Do not panic when it happens. Each time it happens, notice, adjust, return toward the center. Over the years, the adjustments become smaller. And eventually, not quickly, not in a season, not in a year, but eventually, the two capacities will begin to live inside you at the same time. And when they do, you will know it. Because you will stop having to decide which one to use. The situation will present itself. And the correct response, soft or hard, gentle or firm, will arrive in you without deliberation. Because the source of the response will no longer be two separate halves. The source will be the whole man. And the whole man is what your wife was trying to build alongside you. Not a man who was only kind, a man who was kind and hard, as the situation required. She did not have time to finish the building. The unfinished parts, the parts she had been holding for you while you developed them, fell away when she was gone. You are finishing her work now, by yourself. Shiro sat with this. He had not understood that this was the work. For 6 years he had assumed the work had been to continue what she had started. It had not been. The work had been to finish what she had not had time to finish. And he had been, in those 6 years, failing to do it, because he had mistaken the preservation of her specific teaching for the deeper completion of the man she had hoped he would become. He stayed at the forge through the summer, through the autumn, through another winter. And on the second spring, Kyuzo did not stop him when Shiro began to speak of returning. Now, the old man said, you are ready, not because you have finished, because you have understood that you will never finish. And a man who understands this is ready to go back and continue the work in the specific place where the work is meant to continue. The man at the gate. Shiro walked back to the village in the late spring. The walk took 3 days. He walked at the pace of a man who had stopped trying to arrive somewhere and was simply going. The inn was still there, dust on the floors, the small iron box gone, the old sword still above the fireplace because thieves had not known what to do with an old sword that had no particular value. He opened the windows, swept the floors, built a fire, began to prepare for guests. The first guest arrived on the 4th day, a merchant passing through from the coast. Older, honest in the way men are honest when they are not expecting to need to prove anything. Shiro gave him a bed, a bowl of rice, the small courtesies any innkeeper gives. The merchant paid in the morning, left with a small bow. Shiro watched him disappear down the road, and he understood, watching the merchant go, that something was different in him. He had given what he had always given. But underneath the giving, something had changed. He had given freely, but not helplessly. He had given because giving was what the situation required, not because giving was the only thing he knew how to do. The second guest came a week later. Shiro knew within the first 10 minutes that this guest was not what the first had been. The specific quality of attention, the way the man's eyes moved across the room, the small, rehearsed quality of his story about why he was traveling alone. Shiro did not feed him. He looked at the man with the specific quiet steadiness he had learned across 2 years of watching Kyuzo work, and said, "We do not have room tonight." The inn had rooms. The man knew this. He looked at Shiro for a long moment, reading him, and calculating whether Shiro was the kind of man who could be pressed. He saw that Shiro was not that man, not anymore. The man bowed, left. Shiro closed the door. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel hardened. He felt, the word did not quite fit, but it was the closest word he had, complete. He had just refused a man he would once have fed. The refusal had not been cold, had not been suspicious, had not been the reactive hardness Kyuzo had warned him against. It had been simply accurate. He had seen the man for what the man was, and he had responded with what the situation required, without drama, without fear. The integration had begun. Across the years that followed, Shiro became what his wife had hoped he would become. Not quickly. He failed, as Kyuzo had warned him he would, several more times. He turned away a traveler who deserved a bed. He extended credit to a man who had already proven he would not pay it. Each time, he noticed, adjusted, returned toward the center. And over years, over the slow accumulation of small corrected mistakes, the two capacities in him began to settle into a single deeper quality. He was kind. He was hard. The two were, in him, the same thing. Now, here, you are not an innkeeper in a small mountain village, but you have, most likely somewhere in your life, been Shiro at the gate. You have had kindness used against you. You have had your generosity taken advantage of. You have, in some specific form, discovered that the soft version of yourself is not sufficient to protect what matters to you. And you have been tempted, since that discovery, to harden, to become the opposite of what you were. Do not. This is the whole teaching of this story, compressed into a single instruction. Do not become hard in reaction to having been too soft. The hardening will feel like strength. It will feel like you have finally learned the lesson. It will feel like the discerning, world-wise version of yourself that can no longer be taken advantage of. It is not strength. It is the mirror image of the weakness you are trying to leave behind. And men who build their new selves as the mirror image of their old selves end up, 20 years later, alienated from everything they had hoped to protect. The real work is slower than that. It is the work of keeping the kindness and adding to it, adding the specific capacity to see clearly, to say no when no is required, to defend what matters without performing hardness as an identity, to hold both capacities inside yourself simultaneously as expressions of the same deeper thing, which is care for what you love. This work takes years, sometimes decades. It is the work most men never complete, because most men, after their first serious encounter with being taken advantage of, swing to the opposite pole and stay there. They become safer. They also become smaller. Do not swing. Stand, instead, in the uncomfortable middle. Notice where you are still too soft. Notice where you are, after your corrections, now too hard. Return toward the center. Again. And across the years, something will begin to live in you that cannot be easily described. The specific quality of a whole man. Who knows when to open the gate, and who knows, with equal quietness, beyond equal precision, equal absence of drama, when to close it. The inn stood for another 30 years after Shiro's return. His son eventually took it over, his son's son after that, and the story of the 3 men who had cleaned him out. Shiro told it sometimes to younger innkeepers passing through, not as a warning about thieves, as a warning about the specific moment in every kind man's life when the world teaches him, in one hard afternoon, that kindness alone is not enough. And the specific moment, a year or 2 later, when he is tempted to respond to that lesson by becoming the opposite of what he was. Do not, Shiro would say quietly, do not swing. Keep the kindness. It was not your weakness, it was the part of you that was worth preserving. Add the other half, slowly, over years, and stand for the rest of your life. In the uncomfortable middle where both halves are simultaneously available to you. The men who can do this, the men who refuse the easier path of simply becoming hard, are the men the world is eventually protected by. Not from outside, from within themselves. The gate is closed now. The fire is low. And somewhere, tonight, a kind man is standing at his own gate, watching men walk out with everything he had, and wondering what kind of man he is supposed to become next. He thinks he needs to harden. He does not. He needs to add, not replace. The kindness stays. The hardness grows next to it, and across the years the two become one thing, and the one thing is the whole man. If this reached something in you, leave one word below.